So, Stuka Joe here. We're taking a look at Westphalia, designed by Tom Russell, published by Hollandspiele. And we'll take a look at the game features. And this is a 6-player game. Yes, don't try it with less players. It has a heavy diplomatic component, and it is pretty open-ended in terms of things you can actually trade with. That's why you need to play it with 6 players and no less. And the map shows Central Europe, specifically the Holy Roman Empire, at the ending stages of the 30 Years' War. It is divided into areas, a total of 27 areas, and you have 2 types of colors. There are brown-colored areas, and these are the Catholic areas in the Holy Roman Empire. And then we have the green-colored areas, which are those in the Holy Roman Empire that are Protestant. And this game, in addition to recreating the ending stages of the 30 Years' War, also recreates the end of the 80 Years' War between the Dutch Republic and Spain. So we have an inset map of the Netherlands. The map is divided into areas, and in each, or let's say most areas, there are 1, 2, or 3 circles, and each circle represents a point of territory. All territory circles in the Holy Roman Empire that begin the game empty, that is with no token on them, are deemed controlled by Austria. And the other circles that have a claim disc on them, like for example you see here the Upper Palatinate, are controlled by a specific power other than Austria. Now we will take a look at each of the powers on both sides, and we'll focus on their victory conditions to show you the mechanics at play here. This is a game that has very asymmetrical victory conditions, very different for each of the powers on both sides. So let's take a look first at the anti-Habsburg coalition. Here we see France. France begins the game with 8 units in its armies. Yes, France has 2 armies. One army that begins in Lorraine in the Holy Roman Empire map, and the other army begins in Brabant in the Spanish Netherlands map. So we have to divide the unit strength of 8 between both armies. So we allocate 3 to the army in the Netherlands and 5 to the army that is in the Holy Roman Empire map. France begins with 3 points of territory in 3 different areas in the Holy Roman Empire map, and its home area in that map is Lorraine, signified by that blue shield. That means that the other players, their armies, cannot enter the home area of another player. And France also has an army and a claim in the Spanish Netherlands map, that is in Brabant. And you see also that Antwerp serves as the home area of the Dutch and also the French in this particular map. And of course, France is at war with Austria, Bavaria, and Spain. And to win, its debt has to be less than 20 at the end of the game. And also the Dutch Republic and Sweden have to satisfy their victory conditions. So you see that for France to win, she depends on her other 2 allies to win also. So that will dictate much of the action of France in trying to help the Dutch Republic and Sweden attain their victory conditions. And here we see the debt tokens, and debt is the crux of this game. You want to maintain debt at the lowest level possible, because in one way or another it will dictate if a power will satisfy its victory conditions. The next anti-Habsburg power is the Dutch Republic. It begins with an army which has 8 units. However, this is the only power in the game that also has a navy. During the diplomacy phase, and specifically in the recruitment step, the Dutch player can allocate units instead to its army to its navy, and that is signified by placing units in the Dutch sea box space. The Dutch have 6 claim markers, and it is at war throughout the game with Spain. It can make peace with Spain, as we will see later on. And its victory conditions: its debt has to be less than the value of its trade agreements. And how are Dutch trade agreements determined. And it is through the play of these commerce cards that you see here. How are commerce cards obtained? Well, during the diplomacy phase, the Dutch player rolls one die, and if the result is equal or less than the number of units assigned to the Dutch C box, then the Dutch player draws one card from the deck if it is at war with Spain, or two cards from the deck if it is not at war with Spain. And all but one of these cards have a number from 2 to 4. And at the end of the game, the player that possesses commerce cards reduces its nation's debt by the amount reflected in its commerce cards. And for the Dutch trade agreement value is the lowest card in the possession of other players except the Dutch. Now, if the drawn card is this one, the Portuguese card, that is a wasted card. This card represents the war that was going on at the same time between the Dutch and Portugal. So if the Dutch player has a right to draw two cards and draws this one first, he must place this card again in the stack of cards, shuffle them, and then draw the second card. And if the second one is also the Portuguese card, well, tough luck. The Dutch did not draw any commerce card for that turn. The Dutch begin with a debt of 8, which is one of the lowest in the game, and 2 prestige points signified by those 2 purple cylinders. Prestige will earn victory points at the end of the game for a power, and prestige can be gained by trading prestige with another player or by winning battles. And as stated before, the Dutch only play on the Spanish Netherlands map. They begin with their army and 1 claim disc in their home area of Antwerp. Now to the last anti-Habsburg power, that is Sweden. It has an army with a strength of 6 units, and it can recruit 2 units per turn. It has a total of 7 claims discs, so it can claim a pretty hefty chunk of territory. And it starts with a debt of 10 and 2 prestige points. At the beginning of the game, Sweden has 4 claims discs on the Holy Roman Empire map, 1 in Mecklenburg, 1 in Brunswick, 1 in Brandenburg, and 1 in Pomerania. Note that the last 3 areas have an empty point of territory circle. That means that Austria controls those points. So the Swedish could place more discs in those particular circles, or they can head south and go closer to Austria, and there's a lot of territory to be gained there. Austria, of course, they cannot enter Austria because that's Austria's home area. And Sweden is at war with Austria and Bavaria, and to win, its claims, that is the claims discs on the map, plus tolerance has to be greater than their debt. And tolerance is kept track of here in the tolerance track. You see Austria's shield there to the left. It means that Austria controls the tolerance track, and Sweden and the Dutch Republic are her junior partners, as we will explain now. The first way in which the tolerance track can be adjusted is negotiations between Austria and one of the junior partners, in this case Sweden or the Dutch Republic. So let's say that Austria agrees with the Dutch to increase the tolerance track to 4. And the Dutch, for example, agree in exchange for that to give Austria a 3-point commerce card. And there you have an example of the open-ended nature of trades in this game. So tolerance points is something that Austria can trade in agreement either with Sweden or the Dutch Republic. But there are other ways in which the tolerance track can be adjusted. Let's say that Sweden, which is a Protestant power, wins a battle. In that case, the tolerance track is increased by 1. And whenever Bavaria recatholizes a Protestant area, and to do that, it has to begin its military turn in sole possession of all territory points in that area, and we mark it with the recatholization cylinder. In that case, the tolerance level is reduced by 1. And as stated before, for Sweden to win at the end of the game, its claims plus tolerance has to be greater than debt. Just to give you an idea of the challenge here, Sweden starts with a debt of 10 with 4 claims discs and a tolerance of 3. So claims plus tolerance at the beginning of the game is 7, and it needs to exceed its debt level. And of course, they can do that by increasing tolerance and claims, but also by reducing debt. So those are the 3 anti-Habsburg powers. And now let's take a look at the 3 pro-Habsburg powers. Spain begins with an army with a strength of 8 units, and Spain only plays in the Spanish Netherlands map. And note that Spain has claims there, a total of 6 claims in 3 areas, and its army is strong with 8 units. And Spain has 1 more claim disc in case that it can claim that Brabant space that France has. And Spain begins the game with the highest debt level in the game, 20. But it has also 6 prestige points. Now a word about debt here and arrears. There is an arrears step in the diplomacy phase where each of the powers consults this table. And let's say that Spain does nothing to reduce its amount of debt or increase its prestige. When this step comes along, you locate the row, the 20 to 23 row there in the arrears column, which is equal to the total debt of Spain, and cross-reference that row with the prestige column that applies. It's the 5 to 7 prestige because Spain has 6 prestige points. So that would mean that Spain's debt will increase by 3 more. So it will have a debt of 23 after this step. And so we see now that Spain's victory condition is very simple, just to reduce its debt to less than 25. But the prospect of Spain is that that debt will increase easily, and that Spain will have to either obtain swift military victories or try to obtain a large amount of commerce cards to reduce that debt, or at the same time be able to trade prestige points together with some of that debt away to other players. So Spain is in a bind, and that's why Spain is incentivized in this game to reach a peace agreement with the Dutch so that the Dutch can collect 2 commerce cards per turn instead of 1, hoping that they will give one of these cards or both to the Spanish. And another thing to have in mind, especially for Spain, is that whenever a power loses a battle, let's say that Spain loses a battle in the Brabant, a point of prestige is also lost. So that means that Spain has to pick very carefully its battles. And the next power on the Habsburg side is Bavaria, which starts with an army which is 5 units strong and 5 claims discs. Bavaria starts with its army in its home area, together with 1 claim disc there and 1 in the Upper Palatinate. Bavaria starts with a debt of 8, and it has 6 recatholicization cylinders, which it may place in any Protestant Holy Roman Empire area where Bavaria controls all its points of territory. For example, if at the beginning of its turn it controls Saxony, then Bavaria can place there 1 recatholicization cylinder, and that will earn Bavaria victory points at the end of the game. Bavaria is at war with France and Sweden, and to win, the liberties track must be greater than the tolerance level, and claims of Bavaria plus liberties must be greater than debt. Let's take a closer look now at the liberties track. As with the tolerance track, Austria owns the liberties track, but in this case, Bavaria and Sweden are its junior partners, and Austria can negotiate with Bavaria and Sweden, providing shifts to the liberty track to the right in exchange for whatever Bavaria or Sweden want to provide Austria. So let's say, for example, that Austria will provide a liberty shift of 2 spaces in the liberties column in exchange for Bavaria providing 3 army units. So the army units go to Austria, and Austria shifts the Liberties track 2 spaces to the right. Now there are other ways in which the Liberties track can be affected that are, let's say, involuntary and do not involve trading. And this involved the play of these cards, the unrest cards. During the unrest step of the diplomacy phase, Sweden and France jointly decide whether they want to flip 0, 1, or 2 of these unrest cards. And if they can't reach an agreement as to the specific number, none are flipped. But let's say that they decide to flip 1 card. And when a card is flipped, Sweden and France have to decide if one of them wants to take on the additional debts indicated on the card. In this case, 2 additional debt levels. And if, let's say that France will take the debt, in that case, the tolerance marker is increased by 1. Now let's say that neither Sweden or France decide to take on the debt. In that case, the option passes to Austria. And if Austria decides to take the debt, then the tolerance marker is reduced by 1. And note that the unrest deck also has cards that can indicate an increase in liberties at a cost of debt, in which case the adjustment is made in the liberties track. Because of the open-ended nature of the negotiations you can conduct in this game, you can have a situation where, let's say, France agrees to take on the debt just because another power like Holland will take the debt off France's hands. That means Holland will eventually take the debt. So in that case, the tolerance level will be increased by 1. Note the complexity of Bavaria's victory conditions. Liberties has to be greater than tolerance, and Bavaria's claims plus liberties has to be greater than its debt. And finally, the last pro-Habsburg power, of course, is Austria. And Austria begins with 5 units in its army, and it can only recruit 1 unit per turn. And its army begins in its home area. And Austria doesn't have any claims discs because in this game, any area that has a empty point of territory is assumed to be controlled by Austria. Austria starts with a debt of 11, and it is at war with France and Sweden. And to win, Austria must meet all thresholds on its gold card, and Bavaria and Spain must satisfy their victory conditions. At the beginning of the game, these Austrian gold cards are shuffled, and the Austrian player draws 3 of them. The Austrian player examines for himself all 3 cards and keeps only 1, and it is kept secret. To win, Austria must not exceed the thresholds indicated in the card. If it exceeds even 1 threshold, Austria loses. The territory threshold is the maximum number of claims discs allowed in the Holy Roman Empire. The authoritarian threshold is the maximum sum of the liberties and tolerance track. And in this example, that sum would be 6. And the debt threshold is the maximum amount of Austrian debt. And again, exceeding any of these thresholds will disqualify Austria from winning the game. Now we've seen the victory conditions for each of the powers, their initial debt and unit strength levels, any levels of prestige they start with. Now let's take a look at what happens during the diplomacy phase. And on the map, we have all the segments of the diplomacy phase, which are a total of 8 segments. And although the diplomacy phase is organized into different segments, the trading aspect of the game can be executed at any time during the diplomacy phase. So players may trade units, prestige, claims during any of the segments of the diplomacy phase. And the first step is the initiative determination. One claims disc per power is placed in an opaque cup, and they are drawn one at a time and placed from left to right here in the initiative display. And this will be the order in which each of the powers will go during the next military phase. So it will be here Holland, Austria, France, Sweden, Spain, and lastly, Bavaria. The next step is arrears, where all players take on debt per the arrears table. And as we showed before was the possibility with Spain, here we cross-reference Spain's current debt in the arrears column, 20, with its prestige, which is 6, and it gives us a result of 3 in additional debt, and now Spain would have a debt of 23. On the other hand, here we see the Dutch Republic with a debt of 8 and a prestige of 2 would add only 2 to its current debt, which would now be 10. The next step is recruitment. All players gain units, and the Dutch Republic player can place ships in the Dutch sea box. So for instance, Bavaria, that has 5 units, would add 4 more for a total now of 9 units in its army. And it is during the recruitment step that the Dutch player may place units instead of in its army. They may be placed in the Dutch sea box to represent the Dutch Navy. The next step is to roll for Italy. There was a war going on in Italy between Spain and France. So here, 2 dice are rolled, and we refer to the lowest die result, in this example of 3. And then each side, and Spain goes first, must decide whether to return a number of its units to the supply equal to the die result, here it would be 3, or to accrue a number of debts equal to the die result. And then after Spain, France does the same. And in case doubles are rolled, we re-roll the dice until no doubles are obtained. The next step is for Spain to roll for gold, and the Spanish player rolls 1 die, and if the roll is greater than the amount of ships that are in the Dutch sea box, the Spanish player gains 1 prestige. That would happen if the Spanish player rolls a 5 or a 6. But if the Spanish player rolls equal or lower than the number of Dutch ships, then Spain gets its debt increased by 2. However, if Spain is at peace with the Dutch Republic, it gains 1 prestige without having to roll the die. The next step is for the Dutch to roll for trade. The Dutch player rolls 1 die, and if the result is equal or less to the number of ships it has in the Dutch sea box, and let's say that that second card is the Portuguese card, if that happens, well, that's a lost opportunity for the Dutch. The deck is reshuffled, and in this particular instance only 1 commerce card was drawn. And the step ends by removing a number of Dutch ships equal to half of the result, rounded down. In this case, only 1 unit is removed and returned to the unit pool. Next is the unrest step. Here is where France and Sweden jointly decide to flip 0, 1, or 2 cards, and each loses 1 unit per card. And if any player takes on the indicated debt, the track is increased by 1, and if none of these players take the debt, Austria may take it to reduce the track by 1. And we showed an example of that before. Finally, in the final step, we determined that each army has a maximum of 8 units, and negotiations are concluded. So if Bavaria is still sticking around with 9 units, 1 goes back to the unit pool. And those are the steps of the diplomacy phase. And this game alternates between diplomacy and military phases, 3 of each before resolving debt and checking for victory. So now let's take a look at what happens during a military phase. During the military phase, each player resolves their military turn in the order indicated on the initiative track. And as we showed before in this example, the Dutch Republic would go first and Bavaria would go last. Each activated army can move from one area in a theater to an adjacent area as many times as the player wants until the army ends its turn voluntarily or it participates or refuses to participate in a battle. When an army enters or occupies an area that contains an enemy claim, it may, but it's not required to attempt to replace that enemy claim with one of its own. So let's suppose that it's the Swedish player's military turn and he moves his army token from Mecklenburg to Brandenburg. And notice that there's an empty point of territory there. That really means that it belongs to Austria. So the Swedish player may attempt to convert that Austrian claim to a Swedish one. So the Swedish player would pick one of its claim discs and place it in the empty space. So that point of territory does not belong to Austria anymore. And each time a player places one of its claims discs, he has to take a unit cube and place it back into the supply. And this represents Swedish forces garrisoning that point of territory. So the more you move your army around and claim points of territory, your army will weaken. Now, every time that you attempt to claim a point of enemy territory, let's suppose we go back to the example, and the Swedish army moves into Brandenburg and announces it will attempt to claim that empty point of territory there, which, again, really belongs to Austria. In that case, the enemy, in this case, any power on the pro-Habsburg side, in this case Austria or Bavaria, have a chance to intercept. And to intercept successfully, the intercepting army has to trace a chain of friendly areas to the area in question. So, in this example, the Bavarians, which are enemies to the Swedes, can intercept because they can trace a chain of friendly areas through, for example, Bohemia, Saxony, and Brandenburg. Remember that those areas contain at least one point of territory that belongs to Austria. So they are friendly to Bavaria. And in that case, the intercepting army moves into Brandenburg. And now we may have a battle. And here the attacker would be the Bavarians, the defenders, the Swedes. And I say may have a battle because before resolving the battle, the defender has the option to refuse battle. And let's say, for example, that the Swedes decide to refuse battle. In that case, the defending Swedes move their army marker to an adjacent friendly area. And in this example, they move into Pomerania. Notice that they don't retreat into Mecklenburg or refuse battle into Mecklenburg because the Bavarians cannot enter Mecklenburg anyway. But let's suppose that the defender cannot or does not want to refuse battle, then the battle is resolved. We count all units in the defending army and multiply them by 2. So there's 5 units, and the defending Swedes have a strength of 10. And to determine the attacking strength, we count all units in the attacking army and add the sum of 2 dice, which are rolled by the attacker. And here the Bavarians have a strength of 8. 2 dice are rolled with a result of 4 for a total attack strength of 12. And if the total attack strength is greater than the total defense strength, then the attacker wins the battle, like in this example, which the Bavarians won 12-10. There's an exception if you roll doubles. Whenever doubles are rolled, irrespective of the result, the defender wins automatically. But returning to our example, the Bavarians win 12-10. And each participating army loses units equal to the lesser of the 2 die results, in this case, 1 unit. So the Bavarians lose a unit and now have a total of 7. And the Swedes also lose a unit and now their army has a strength of 4. And also the loser of the battle loses a point of prestige, so the Swedes now only have 1. And the winning power receives 1 prestige point for winning the battle. And in this case, Bavaria now has 1 point of prestige. And whenever Sweden or the Dutch Republic win a battle, the tolerance track is increased by 1, but that didn't happen in this example. Finally, the loser of the battle has to retreat, and it can be through any number of friendly areas. But the caveat is that they have to be friendly areas. In this example, of course, the Swedes can retreat into Pomerania. And then the winner of the battle, in this case Bavaria, can place one of its claims discs there. And in this case, Bavaria places one of its claims discs in the empty space in Brandenburg and removes one of its units from the army to signify that it is garrisoning that space. And as we stated before, France has 2 armies in the game, so whenever it's France's turn, and in this example, France is the 3rd power in the initiative track, it can move and fight with its 1st army, whichever it chooses, but if that army loses a battle, it forfeits the turn for the 2nd army. So the play in this game alternates from diplomacy to military, back to diplomacy, military phase, diplomacy, military phase, diplomacy phase, and finally we reach the part where we resolve debt and check victory. And victory conditions are checked in a certain order. First, you check the victory conditions for Bavaria, followed by Spain, and then followed by Austria. And then you check the victory conditions for the Dutch Republic, Sweden, and then France. First, we check for fluctuation. We roll 2 dice and increase the debt of all powers by the lower of the 2 dice. And if doubles are rolled, no increase in debt occurs. Next, each power except the Dutch reduce their debt by the value of the commerce cards that they have. So let's say that in this example, Spain has 2 commerce cards with a value of 5. So let's say that Spain's debt at this time is 28, so we reduce it to 23. And notice that if it stays at 23, Spain will satisfy its victory conditions. Now, to reduce the Dutch debt by commerce cards, you only count the lowest card that each other player has. So let's say that in our example, a total of 5 commerce cards were traded by the Dutch to other powers. Spain received 2, so only the lowest one counts for the Dutch total. So we're at 2. And France also received 2, and we count the lowest one there. Another 2, and we're at 4. And Sweden only received 1 card with a value of 3, so we add that one in 2 for a total of 7. So the Dutch can reduce their debt by 7. Their debt, let's say it's at 15, so it goes down to 8. Now we go to taxes. Sweden, Bavaria, and the Dutch Republic reduced the total of their debt by the number of claims they have on the map. Sweden can only count its claims on Protestant areas, and if this is an example here, it could deduct 8 from its debt because it has 8 claims discs in Protestant areas. And Bavaria can only count claims that are in Catholic areas, and in this example they have 1 in Alsace, 1 in Bavaria, and 1 in the Upper Palatinate, so they could deduct 3 debt. And Austria reduces its debt by the number of areas, not territory, in the Holy Roman Empire that do not possess any Swedish, French, or Bavarian claims. And then France reduces its debt by the number of areas in the Holy Roman Empire that do possess Swedish, French, or Bavarian claims. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic reduces their debt by the number of points of territory that they possess. So if this is the ending situation, they only reduce the debt by 1. And then France and Spain compare their holdings to see which side has more claim markers. In the Netherlands, the side that has more claim markers reduces their debt by 5. In this example, it would be Spain. And next, each player reduces their debt by half of their remaining units. And for the Dutch, that includes ships, and you round up any fractions. So if the Dutch ended with an army with a strength of 3 and a fleet with a strength of 2, the total would be 5, and we divide it by 2, and that would be 2.5, which is rounded up to 3, so the debt is reduced by 3, and the Dutch would have a debt of 5. And we check all powers for the number of units they have and divide them by 2 and reduce debt accordingly. Next, all players reduce their debt by the number of prestige points that they have. So if Spain has 4 prestige points, we reduce their debt from 23 to 19. And Sweden reduces its debt by the sum of the tolerance track, which in this case shows a 3, and the liberties track, which in this example is a 2. So Sweden would reduce its debt by 5 points. And the Dutch Republic would reduce its debt by the current position on the tolerance track, which we showed that was a 3, so it would have a debt of 2. And finally, Bavaria would reduce its debt by the current position on the liberties track. We showed that it was a 2, so its debt would go down to 6. And also by the sum of Bavarian recatholization markers. Let's say there were none placed, so no further debt is reduced. So at the end of the game, if less than 6 players have met their victory conditions, those who did win the game. If none have met their victory conditions, all lose. And if all meet their victory conditions, we have to now determine a single winner. And here is where that affinity rating comes in play, because, of course, on the Habsburg side, all powers are Catholic, but France is on the anti-Habsburg side, and it is also Catholic. So Catholic powers score 1 victory point for each Catholic area, and also for areas that have been recatholized, like in this example, Franconia and Württemberg, which were recatholized by Bavaria. On the downside is that Catholic players score negative victory points equal to the level on the tolerance track, plus the number of areas that have Swedish claim markers and Dutch claim markers. Now the Protestant powers, which are the Dutch Republic and Sweden, score victory points equal to the position of the marker on the tolerance track. And the major powers, which are Spain, Austria, Sweden, and France, score a victory point for each card remaining on the unrest deck. So if we have 3, 4, 5, 6 cards remaining, that's 6 victory points for each of the major powers. Now the minor powers, which are Bavaria and the Dutch Republic, score victory points according to the position of the marker on the liberties track. And finally, the Holy Roman Empire powers, that is Austria, Bavaria, and Sweden, score victory points equal to the amount indicated on Austria's gold card, in this case, 3 victory points. Victory points are tallied, and the power with the most positive victory points wins. If all have negative victory points, the power with the amount of negative victory points closest to 0 wins. And in cases of ties, the power that is closest to the starting position in the initiative display wins the game. Points of territory are important also when conducting battles, and it can wreck an army if there are no friendly areas to retreat into. Let's suppose that there was a battle here between the Bavarians and the Austrians in Brandenburg, and the Bavarians lost. Of course, they absorbed whatever losses as a result of the battle, and now they have to retreat. And they can only retreat into a friendly area. They cannot retreat into Lusatia because it's completely controlled by Sweden, nor Silesia. So the Bavarian army has no choice but to retreat through an enemy area. And for each enemy area that an army has to retreat through, it will lose 1 unit from its army. And in this particular example, the second area retreated into is Bohemia, which is friendly to the Bavarians because it is controlled by Austria. So in this game, players have to be mindful when conducting military operations how many units they want to use for purposes of claiming territory. If you use too much, your army becomes too weak. And if you use too few, your army may be routed when it has to retreat through 1 or more enemy areas. And we have reached the end of this video. This is Westphalia, a game that recreates military and diplomatic aspects of the end of the 30 Years' War and 80 Years' War in Europe. Designed by Tom Russell, published by Hollandspiele. And I hope that this video has given you a good idea of the flow of the game and what the game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.